Hi, Patrick. This is Ali Çağlar, a professor of the Political Science Department. I just would like to welcome you and also to thank you. I'm so grateful to see you in here and to spare your time for our students. And really, I'm so glad to see you. I'm sure all our colleagues and students will get benefit from your presentation. And we are really appreciated your behavior and your answers and your collaboration. I hope in the future we will continue to work together. At least you have a place in here, Hacettepe University Department of Political Science.
Thank you.
Whenever you need or to make, for example, your sabbatical or anything else, you always be welcomed, and we will be very grateful to have you and to collaborate you. Again, thank you so much for replying positively and giving this conference to us. Again,
most
welcome to our program.
Thank you very much, Professor Ali. It's a real honor for me to be here, and it's no trouble at all. I suppose, in a way, like every long career, my career has been very fortunate in some ways. I'm a geologist and a geographer by background, and had I not traveled and lived in the Pacific Islands for a long time, I would probably be a very conventional geologist and geographer. But I have been exposed to societies that are quite unlike those in England, where I grew up. And I've learned a lot of things, and I want to talk about some of those things today. So thank you once again, Metin, for the very warm welcome. And you can see the title there, Vanished Islands and Hidden Continents in the World's Oceans. Okay, just see if I can, there we are. So it really is an honor to talk to you today, and my thanks to you and Metin and to Hamza for organizing this talk, and I hope everything I have to say will be of interest to you. So what I want to do today is to talk about four things. The first thing I want to talk about is telling stories, and Metin alluded to the fact that every society in the world for most of its history has told stories. And I think that we underestimate the importance of storytelling in the ways that we have learned to think about our world and to understand the world around us. So I'll talk a little bit about that. And then I wanted just to sort of go straight in to talk about some of the false stories about vanished islands and continents. And I think that this is very important because most of the stories that most people seem to know about vanished islands and continents are not true, or at least are not true in essence. At the same time, a lot of these stories also have elements of truth that their creators drew from particular places. So in part 2, I will talk about Mu, and I will talk about Atlantis and some other places as well. Then I want to sort of step back and become a geologist again and talk about why islands and continents vanish, because they do. There's no question about that. When we look at human history, humans have been on Earth. Our species has been on Earth for almost 200,000 years. And in that time, the sea level has gone up and down, land has moved up and down. So there's lots of situations in which islands and continents have, or parts of continents have vanished. And then I want to end up today by talking about the future and some of the research that I've been doing recently that suggests that we can learn from the past about what is expected to happen in the future. So let's start straight away with part one and telling stories. Humans and storytelling go back a long way. And I think it's worth making this point that modern humans like us have been on Earth for almost 200,000 years. And for almost all of that time, they could not read or write, but they survived. And the reason they survived, I suggest, is because they were able to communicate knowledge and understanding orally in ways that we do today, but much more than that. And in Turkey, Turkey is famous for the art of the medar and the traditional storytelling. But this is also something that occurred in other societies as well. And it was a very important way of communicating information that was not simply interesting, but was also very important for survival. You needed to know how the world worked in order to be able to survive there. But it was through these kinds of storytelling traditions that humans, I suggest, evolved a love of stories. And I don't know about you, but certainly when I was growing up, I used to read stories all the time. I loved stories, and I think that humans have evolved a love of stories, a love of narrative, and also a faith in the correctness of knowledge that was communicated orally. And of course, it wasn't just in Turkey. Here is poor old Plato, and here is a storyteller from India, another from the Pacific, another from North America, another from France. And I think what we are learning today is that storytellers did not just operate in isolation. They also were poets, they were singers, they were performers. So a lot of the dancing, for example, that you see in different cultures around the world, I think that probably originated as part of the same tradition, if you like, of communicating knowledge orally in the absence of reading and writing. And of course, rock art. People travel to Australia to look at the Aboriginal rock art, and they say, oh, how beautiful, what a beautiful creation. But I think when this rock art was created, I think it was created for very practical reasons. I think it was created to store information that storytellers could access, and all sorts of things like that. So I think that our understanding of the importance of storytelling is making us reconsider the meaning of art, the meaning of performance, the meaning of poetry, and all this kind of thing. So when humans became literate, what, 300, 400, 500 years ago, attitudes towards oral communication started to change. And we started to think, I'm not saying we, but humanity started to think that oral communication was not as accurate, was not as high status as written communication. And oral knowledge, I think, became less esteemed, less valued as a source of knowledge. And it came to be regarded as fiction. And I think a lot of the stories of so-called mythologies, particularly in European cultures, a lot of those mythologies began as oral knowledge traditions, and they came to be regarded by us today as fiction. And then, of course, these stories became fiction. So the basis of a lot of novels, like the Harry Potter novels, those novels are clearly rooted in oral traditions of different cultures around the world, but they are at the same time fiction. Now, within the last 20 years, science has recognized two very important things about oral stories. The first is that many of these oral stories that once we used to dismiss as myth or legend, actually they are more likely to be memories of actual events, particularly unforgettable events like volcanic eruptions or giant waves or meteorite falls and so on. And every person who studies storytelling in Europe has heard of Yunus Emre, the great Turkish poet and folklorist. And like many people of his time, around about the transition from orality to literacy, he took oral stories and oral traditions and he rendered them in ways that allowed them to eventually be written down. The equivalent in Britain, for example, would be Sir Thomas Malory, who wrote down oral traditions like the stories of King Arthur and things like that, that eventually became a kind of fictional genre all by themselves. The second thing, and I will come back to this later in the talk, but the second thing is that many oral stories have survived for thousands of years, far longer than most scientists once thought, and in fact most people think. I get a lot of emails from people who've read something that I've written, and they are saying, well, it's all very well for you to claim that stories can be passed down for thousands of years, but have you listened to stories? People don't remember things that go back more than 20 or 30 years or 50 years at the most. And I say, but today the situation is different. Today, if we want to know something, we pick up our phone and we ask our phone. We don't need to remember things today in the way that we once did need to. Look, and probably Professor Ali and myself are probably old enough to remember when you used to have to remember people's telephone numbers, and you used to go to a telephone, you pick up and you used to dial the number. You had to remember people's telephone numbers in those days, or have them written on the wall. But today, how many telephone numbers? Do you even know your own telephone number? Or do you just press your name or your friends' names? So things have changed. And I think that if we could go back 700, 800 years, we would find that people's capacity for accumulating knowledge in their heads and being able to teach that knowledge to others was far greater than we might expect. So let me just give you a couple of examples about how long these traditions can survive. This is a meteorite crater in the Apennine Mountains in Sicily. And in about the year 412 AD, this area was famous for its pagan ceremonies and things like that. And Christianity was spreading in the areas around, but these people were not interested in being Christianized. But one evening, there was a meteorite fell to Earth, and it crashed to Earth with a resounding thump in the next valley along. And the people took this as a sign, and they converted overnight to Christianity, and they've never strayed from that since then. They took it as a message from God. The point here is that this story was first written down about 140 years ago, but this story has been around for 1600 years. So most of that time it's been passed down orally from one generation to the next. And a really surprising example is from the Western United States. If you ever go to Oregon in the Western United States, you should go and visit Crater Lake, which is a volcanic crater. It's the remains of a huge volcano that once stood like this above the landscape, and it exploded and then it collapsed in on itself and created this crater-like landform that you see there today. We know that this volcano collapsed about 7,600 years ago. But when the first people reached that area and wrote down what the local people were saying, the Klamath people were saying, the Klamath had a story about this event. And it's a detailed story. It's a detailed story about what this mountain looked like, and how the god over here was fighting the god inside the mountain, and how the whole mountain shook and then it collapsed in on itself. So we have no alternative except to believe that this story has been passed down for 7,600 years. And that, wow, that really makes you think, well, that says something about oral traditions that most people are not aware of. So going back to humans and storytelling, the question that I might ask is, how long can memories endure in oral societies? Where, in other words, is the edge of memory, which just happens to be the title of the book I wrote in 2018. And Metin, I will send you a copy of the book. Okay, so you are not to go and buy a copy of the book. I don't need the money. I will certainly send you. I've already made a note.
Thank you.
You're welcome. But you know, where is the edge of memory? And in this book, I show that there are all sorts of different memories that have endured in oral societies for more than 5,000 years, and a few that are certainly likely to have survived for more than 10,000 years. So it depends on the circumstances. If you have a society that is isolated from other societies, oral traditions can be passed down very easily. If you have a society where knowledge is important for survival, because the environment, for example, is very harsh, then again, oral stories of this kind, or oral knowledge, will last for a very long time. So let me move on to the second part of my talk and talk about some of the false stories that we know about, why they are false, and what elements of truth there are within them. So there are many stories, as you all know very well, of islands and continents once occupied by people that have vanished. And if you look at the three maps there on the right, in the Atlantic Ocean, we have Atlantis, and we have other possible continents as well. And this was an invention of the Greek philosopher Plato, and he said that Atlantis was an island continent, which was to the west of the Strait of Gibraltar. In the Indian Ocean, we have a supposedly vanished continent, or submerged continent, known as Lemuria, and there are Tamil traditions that I'll talk about in a second that are relevant there. And in the Pacific, we have the lost continent of Mu. It's very important to understand that none of these places ever existed. And the simplest reason we know they never existed, and this is me speaking as a geologist, is that continents cannot sink. Continents are made of less dense material than the ocean crust. So it's the same thing as if you have a cork in a glass of water. You can push the cork down, but the cork will come back up to the surface. And it's the same thing with continents. They will always float, not on the ocean, they will always float on the Earth's crust underneath the ocean, because this crust is denser than this crust. So continents cannot sink. So that's the main reason why none of these places ever could possibly sink. But a lot of the stories about these places have elements of truth. And perhaps in one place an island sank, and then over time that island becomes bigger and bigger. It becomes a continent because you really want people to believe the story. So you talk about a continent that sunk, and then you populate it with all sorts of fantastic beings and so on, and you make the continent sink in all kinds of dramatic circumstances. That's all storytelling. And the essence of the story is often a lot less dramatic. So, yeah, Atlantis, Lemuria, and Mu. And again, I have to say that none of these places existed, because if they did exist, we would have known about them a long time ago. I get people, again, who send me lots of emails telling me that they have found Atlantis in Indonesia, or they found Atlantis in the Himalaya mountains, or they found Atlantis under the ice of Antarctica. And look, the ice is melting, Atlantis is starting to come out, we'll all see it. And that's the main reason Atlantis is not a real place, because if it was a real place, it would only be in one place. It wouldn't be in 100 different places. So there is no Atlantis in West Africa. There is no Atlantis in Indonesia. There is no Atlantis in the Atlantic Ocean, or even in the Mediterranean, or even in the Bahamas, or whatever. So I think that's an important point. But what is interesting is what these stories can tell us about things that actually happened in the past. So let's talk first of all very briefly about Atlantis. Plato, the Greek philosopher, he had these ideas about what an ideal society should look like and how that society should be organized. And very interestingly, Plato was also very fond of what he called, I've forgotten the term he used, but the necessary lie. Plato often said that a good leader was required to lie sometimes to the people in order to rule the society justly. So Plato was no stranger to lying, but he realized that his ideas about an ideal society and the way it should be organized would be much more compelling if he could attach those details to a real place. So he created Atlantis. And in the Eastern Mediterranean, as you know very well, where Plato lived, there were lots of earthquakes, quite dramatic earthquakes, large waves, tsunamis. And there were probably at the time Plato was living many memories about 400 years earlier of the, about a millennium earlier of the terminal eruption of Santorini Island and others like it. So Plato had lots of real life events with dramatic details from which he was able to borrow to create his Atlantis narrative and make the whole story more believable. But let's move to the Pacific. Unless you really know the Pacific, sometimes you don't realize that it's almost 1/3 of the entire Earth's surface. It's a massive area. Australia down there in the bottom left is about the same size as Europe. Crossing from one side of Australia to the other is like going from Portugal to Turkey. So it's a huge area, the Pacific, and it's dotted with islands. And in the map that you can see on the screen, I have made the islands actually much larger than they really are, because otherwise you wouldn't be able to see those islands. Now, when the first Europeans arrived in the Pacific, they called themselves explorers, but of course the Pacific had already been explored. But when they arrived, they couldn't believe that people living on islands, for example, in Solomons and islands in the Hawaii group, spoke essentially the same language. They did the same things. They built the same types of boats. They built the same types of houses. They were clearly culturally connected. But they couldn't believe that these people, and I have to say there was a racist element to this, they couldn't believe that these dark-skinned people were able to outperform European sailors and cross between islands in sailboats, hundreds, sometimes thousands of kilometers distant. So people like James Cook came up, or at least planted the seeds for the idea that there was once in the Pacific a continent called Mu. He didn't call it Mu. I don't know who called it Mu, but there was a once in the Pacific, there was a continent. And one day that continent sunk. And the only people who survived were the ones who were left on the mountaintops. So if you lived on a mountain on Mu, then the chances are that you survived. And that's one representation of Mu. And it doesn't exist. There's no way that Mu could possibly exist. We would have found it long ago, geologists would have found it long ago if it did exist. What Mu shows is that there are connections between places like Fiji and Hawaii, places like French Polynesia and Micronesia. There are connections there, but those connections can be explained by people who were able to cross the oceans, not by people who were able only to walk across the land. So in a way, Mu is an expression of European puzzlement at being confronted with a massive ocean dotted with islands, all of which had people living on them. So I know Mu has a place in Turkey's popular traditions, but the clear message is that there was never a place called Mu in the Pacific or indeed anywhere else. The third continent that I want to just talk about briefly is the continent of Lemuria in the Indian Ocean. And again, this was an inference made by a German biologist, Ernst Haeckel, in 1868, to explain the distribution of certain plants and animals, particularly the lemurs, around the edge of the Indian Ocean. He couldn't think of any other way why you would get lemurs in Madagascar and in Indonesia, unless there had once been a land mass in the middle across which those lemurs could walk. We know now that it was all plate tectonics. We know now that when India broke off from the southern part of Africa about 80 million years ago, it carried, not 80 million, sorry, it's about 20 million years ago, it carried plants and animals with it. And it was the movement of continents within the Indian Ocean that led to the distribution of similar plants and animals around its fringes. But what was really interesting about Lemuria was that it parallels a Tamil Indian tradition about the sunken land of Kumari Kandam. And there's an old map there of Kumari Kandam. It never existed, but I'm very interested in the origins of Tamil traditions about Kumari Kandam, because it has nothing to do with lemurs, it has nothing to do with the distribution of plants and animals. It only has to do with memories of people. So Lemuria never existed, but Kumari Kandam, those stories probably originated when sea level rose after the last ice age and flooded huge tracts of land off the coast of southern India. And I'll just read this quickly. O Indian Ocean, where did you conceal our Tamil Nadu, our ripe old land? Why did you plunder the 49 Tamil territories thousands of years ago? Where is that fine ancient river Palruli? Where is the incomparable Mount Kumari filled with beauty? Where is the city of Denmadurai, famed for the first Tamil Academy, over which presided the Lords Shiva and Murugan? This is a good example of the kind of Tamil tradition that is still extant in southern parts of India. And to me, they clearly, these kinds of traditions and the tradition of Kumari Kandam represent memories of the time when, in fact, this area was flooded and people had to move. So that brings me on to the third part of my talk. Why do islands and sometimes parts of continents vanish? There are two main reasons. And they're very simple to understand. Either the ocean surface rises and covers the land, or the land itself drops beneath the sea, perhaps because it slides, or perhaps because it's shaken and drops down in an earthquake. So it's not difficult to understand why these things happen. And we know that they have happened many, many times during the period of modern human occupation of the earth. So this is the only complicated graph I'm going to show you today, but just try to look at it. It's a graph that shows time along the bottom. On the left, 150,000 years ago, so modern humans were around, to today on the right. And it shows the changes of the ocean surface over the last 150 years or so. So you can see that the sea level about 130, 140,000 years ago was around 140 meters lower than it is today. And then it rose very sharply. And then it fell in a series of steps. And about 18,000 years ago, 20,000 years ago, was a time that is called the last glacial maximum. What that means is that this was the coldest time of the last great ice age. And you can see that the level of the ocean surface on average, everywhere in the world, was about 120 meters, 125 meters lower than it is today. So it was much lower. And then you can see what happened. So we live in a drowned world. What I mean by that is that if we look at today on the top right, modern sea level, that's where we are today. But if you look at the average sea level or the average ocean surface over the last 150,000 years, it's about 50 meters lower than it is today. So we live in a world today that is drowned compared to the way that it has been for most of the time that modern humans have been here. And I think that's really important to understanding our human mind and our mindset when it comes to thinking about lands beneath the ocean surface. All this drowning occurred, the recent drowning occurred during the time that people were around. People lived almost everywhere on the surface of the earth during the last glacial maximum. And look what happened at the end of the last glacial maximum. The level of the ocean surface rose rapidly. It rose about 120 meters in about 7,000 or 8,000 years. That's far, far faster than it's rising today. It was a massive change. All over the world, coastal communities, they were having to cope with the loss of, kilometers of land every 10 years from the coasts. So this was a very rapid rise of sea level. So like I say there, it's no surprise that humans have so many stories about submerged lands. And a good example is Australia. Australia lost nearly 23% of its land area after the last ice age because of this rapid sea level rise. So you can see the golden area there is Australia as it is today, and the pale area is the way that Australia was during the last glacial maximum, when the ocean surface was about 120 meters lower than it is today. So thousands of kilometers have been submerged off the coast of Australia, in several parts of Australia. What did the people there think about this? Well, there were people there, and a lot of the stories, not a lot, but a number of the stories from that time have come down to us today. So people lived in every part of this land at this time. And with a colleague of mine, we have collected stories now from 21 places all the way around the coast of Australia, which recall this sea level rise after the end of the last ice age. And the interesting thing is that the sea level rise stopped about 7,000 years ago. So all of these stories must be at least 7,000 years old. They must have been passed down from one generation to the next for at least 7,000 years. And I'm going to give you two examples just to illustrate what I mean. The first example comes from Kangaroo Island in South Australia. And the second example comes from the Gulf of Carpentaria in the north of Queensland. So Kangaroo Island is this island that you can see on this satellite image that is off the coast of the Australian mainland. And this is what the gap looks like today. So we have, I don't know if you can see my mouse, but in this area here is the narrowest part, and that's what's shown here. It's a place called Backstairs Passage. And Backstairs Passage reaches a depth, a minimum depth of about 32 meters today. So this is a map of the area showing Kangaroo Island on the left and the mainland of Australia on the upper right. And you can see Backstairs Passage in there. And a lot of the Aboriginal people who live in this area have stories that talk about this tall, powerful man called Gurunduri. He had two wives. No comment there. He had two wives who were running away from him, and they were running away from him along the south coast of the Fluria Peninsula, and he was following them. When they got to this area here, the story goes that they were able to walk across Backstairs Passage to Kangaroo Island through a combination of walking on dry land and wading through water up to the knees. Now, Gurunduri was not very happy about this, and when he reached the place where they had started walking, he summoned the waves to rise up and drown his two wives, and their bodies were washed in this direction, and they became these islands down here, which are known today as the Pages. And ever since that time, Backstairs Passage has been submerged. So I think of this as a memory of a time when it was possible for people to walk from what is now the mainland of Australia to what is now an island offshore. And that is because the ocean surface, the sea level, was lower than it is today. The second example comes from the Gulf of Carpentaria in Queensland. There are people living today on all of these islands offshore here. and here is the Australian mainland there. And some of the Aboriginal stories here talk about how in the beginning our home islands were not islands at all, but part of a peninsula running out from the mainland. So in other words, the stories are saying that all of this area here was dry land. It was just a peninsula of the mainland. And then our people say that the channels that you see cut in here were caused by Gangur, a seagull woman who dragged a big raft back and forth across the peninsula and cut the peninsula and allowed the sea in. So again, to me, this looks like a clear recollection of a story by people who've lived in the area for more than 7,000 years, recalling a time when the sea level rose up across the land and created islands where none existed before. This post-glacial rise of sea level gave rise to many stories of vanished lands in many parts of the world. And two stories that I've been studying recently, particularly with colleagues from France, is the story of the submerged city of Ys, Y-S, which is off the coast of Brittany in France. And someone even wrote an opera about the submergence of Ys. And also the story of Cantra Gwaelod in Wales. These are two of many stories about submerged lands from this part of Northwest Europe. So what I'm trying to do here is trying to show that the stories from Australia are not unique, that they are paralleled in certain other parts of the world. And these are some of the places in Northwest Europe where we've collected stories. You can see there's a huge number here off the coast of Brittany, and several in Wales and some in Cornwall here. That was Ys and that was Cantra Gwaelod. Okay, that's changes of sea level, and the rise of sea level is one reason why land disappears. The other reason why land disappears is because it's shaken or it slips or it's blown up. This is what an island that today we call Ritter Island looked like in 1843 and in Papua New Guinea. And this is how it looks today. There's hardly any of it left. And we know now that in 1888, there was a collapse of the island's western flank that caused it to almost completely disappear. We know less about that than we do about the huge waves, the tsunami waves that it created and which washed across nearby coastlines. And this is how these things happen. So if you look at A there is an island sticking up above the ocean surface. You can have a landslide on the side of that island, and eventually you can have so many landslides that, as you can see in D, the island itself disappears beneath the ocean surface. The island itself hasn't sunk. It's just that its top has been cut back and has collapsed. And great examples come from the islands of Hawaii in the North Pacific. And you can see the main islands of Hawaii there in the orange. And what you can't see, because they're all underwater, are these landslides that once took away huge chunks of the islands of Hawaii. So these islands were once much bigger than they are today, but they've been affected by these massive flank landslides that have carried away huge portions of these islands below sea level. And if you go to Oahu Island today, you can climb up and you can see the back of the Nuuanu landslide there on Hawaii. That's this one here. I want to just give you an example of a really nice story from the Pacific Islands that talks about a land which vanished. And this was a story that I was first told orally in Solomon Islands, and which has a really good geological explanation. So just bear with me for a few slides here. This is part of the central part of the Solomon Islands island group, and there is an island here, Te Onimenu, which is no longer there. So what happened to it is a very interesting story. And it begins with a man from Aliite Island who married a woman from Te Onimenu, and they lived together on Aliite. But after 9 years, when her family visited from Te Onimenu, the wife decided to elope, to run away with one of the visitors, and she went back to her home island with him. And her husband was very upset, and he got in his canoe and he went to consult a magic woman on the island of Dai, and he purchased a curse which he paddled back to Te Onimenu, and he planted it secretly one night on Te Onimenu. The next day he went home to Aliite, and he climbed a high rock and he witnessed the destruction of Te Onimenu. And the stories talk about 8 waves that hit the island in succession, shaking the island from its foundations. And the husband was really happy with all this, and so on and so on. Almost certainly that story, and there's a lot of stories, a lot of versions of that story, talk about an island that once existed here, which was shaken in an earthquake, which caused the tsunami waves, and then slipped down this very steep undersea slope where it probably lies today. So this is a good example of where an oral tradition has given us information, geological information, that we wouldn't otherwise have known. And I just talked very briefly about continents and how they cannot vanish suddenly, except in the minds of people you should not trust. And the founder of Theosophy, Helena Blavatsky, she believed that she was given knowledge by her spirit guides, and that's probably not true. But that knowledge allowed her to believe in a place called Mu and its catastrophic end. And she influenced people like James Churchward. He called himself Colonel James Churchward, but he wasn't a colonel at all. He just invented the title. He said that Mu came to an end in the following way. Listen to this. Cataclysmic earthquakes rent Mu asunder. She became a fiery vortex, and the waters of the Pacific rushed in, making a watery grave for a vast civilization and 60 million people. Okay, I'm sorry, this is not true. There is not any truth in these stories. But I think also it's important to understand that we often want to believe in these types of things. We want to believe in other worlds. We want mystery in our lives. We want to be excited by things that science doesn't know. And that's a very, very powerful motivator for people to believe in stories like this. And when I was growing up, I loved this kind of thing. You know, when I was 16, I couldn't read enough of this kind of thing. I was fascinated by it, and that was probably one reason why I became a geologist, because I wanted to learn more about this. So yes, here is the new book. I'm really not recommending that you go and buy it. It's written for a popular audience. It's not a specialist book. But why people believe in these kinds of places is very interesting. And you know, I think there's a lot of issues around this that I cover in this new book, which is coming out in August. So I'm sure the library would like to buy a copy of it. So the last part of my talk today, and Metin, this is going to take about another 10 minutes.
Sure, of course.
Is looking to the future. So can we learn anything from the past to help us cope with the future? Well, we do live in a drowned world where the sea level is much higher than it has been on average for the last 150,000 years or so. And unfortunately, we also live in a drowning world, one in which the sea level is likely to continue to rise for the next few 100 years. You know, there's no getting away from this. I was giving a talk to a group of climate scientists a few days ago, and one of them said to me afterwards, on the Zoom, they said, well, maybe there will be a miracle. Maybe the sea level will stop rising in the year 2050. And I said, maybe. I said, you know, it's true. Nobody can predict the future. Nobody can predict what you're going to have for dinner this evening. But you can smell what's coming out of the kitchen and you can think, well, yeah, probably gosleme, you know, probably this, probably that. So we have ways not of predicting the future, but we have ways of projecting the future. And it does seem that there probably won't be a miracle and that sea level will continue to rise for the next few 100 years. This is not the first time that humans have had to cope with this kind of thing. Here is the 2019 Ipcc figures. Again, we don't have to go into it in great detail. We're somewhere around here at the moment, and probably by the end of this century, sea level will be around about 80, 90, 100 centimeters higher than it is today. And it's likely that as time goes on, sea level will continue to rise until or unless we get greenhouse gas emissions under control, in which case sea level might rise much less rapidly beyond 2100. But the point here is that in the short term, there is nothing that we can do as a global society to stop the sea level from rising. We have almost certainly caused this to happen, but we didn't really know that we were causing it. So blaming ourselves is not very helpful. When we look to the future, there's two things that we can do. The first thing is, and they're both important, the first thing is mitigation. So mitigation is about addressing the causes of global warming, which is causing sea level rise. So what do we do about the causes of rising sea levels? How do we stop the sea level from rising so much in the future? And adaptation is changing the ways that we live in order to avoid the worst effects of future sea level rise. And wherever you live along the world's coast, you know, as you can see in this picture here, you know what is happening. The sea level is rising and it's causing flooding more frequently than has been the case in the past. But I want to ask whether there is anything we can learn from the past that can help us manage the future. And this was the premise of a lot of storytelling in oral societies. Learn from the past in order to manage the future. Let us give you all the knowledge that we have accumulated in our heads. Let us give that to you so that you can understand your world and you can cope with whatever the world throws at you. Of course, we can share knowledge in other ways today, but this kind of knowledge is not as complete, I suggest, as oral knowledges once were. So 3 things. What can we learn about the future from our ancestors' memories of the past? Well, I think the first and most important thing is that in the past, humans, our ancestors, have encountered profound challenges to their existence and have overcome these. Okay, we should try as hard as we possibly can to combat the challenges from future climate change, of course, but the outlook is not hopeless. We will survive, and I think that this is a very important message. I find today, especially with young people, that a lot of them are in despair because they think climate change is going to change our lives so profoundly that life won't be worth living. And I say to them, change has always happened throughout history. Humans have changed. They've changed the way they live in order to adapt. Adaptation is not something new. So the outlook is not hopeless, but of course it will be disruptive. And I just give you one last story from Australia. This is from the Nullarbor coast of Western Australia. And one of these old Aboriginal stories is that sea level rise had caused such stress for the people that they became determined to act by themselves. And the people poured over this escarpment, this cliff that you can see here, and the shoreline was out here somewhere. And they began piling up thousands of wooden spears to stop the water coming in on the land. In other words, they went out there and they built sea walls, they built sea defenses to try and stop the water encroaching on the land. So they did something about it, just as we do today. And the story goes that these bundles of spears were stacked very high, and they managed to stop the water rising very much further. So the second thing I think we can learn from our ancestors' memories of the past is that the most effective and sustainable types of adaptation are localized ones. It shouldn't be two localized ones, it should be our localized ones. Designed and driven by local residents, not top-down, not dependent on external funding. And one of the sites that I've been working on is Whangasā village in Samoa, where you can see people here are starting to move by themselves up the slope, because this area here is becoming too wet. Every time the tide is high, the water is rushing into the village, and it's very difficult to live there. So people are relocating by themselves, autonomously, up the slope. And I think that's something that we can learn from history, is that we shouldn't wait for someone in Geneva or New York to tell us what to do or to give us the money to do something. We need to act ourselves. We need to help ourselves, because I think especially in 10 years' time, when so many places are going to be experiencing what Whangasā is experiencing today, we'll have no choice but to help ourselves. And I know this picture is from Greece, but the third thing that I think we can learn about the future from our ancestors' memories of the past is that there are people who want to deny what is happening. There are the Donald Trumps of this world who will say anything rather than give their people the truth, the bad news. And I think that popular protest is very helpful in changing the mindset of people, of decision makers, and making sure that our leaders do the right thing, because the sooner that we accept what is happening rather than denying it, the sooner we act, the less impact things like climate change will have on the ways that we live. So I have a website if you want to look at any more of these things, but my thanks to you all for attending and for listening to my talk.